Collectivization of agriculture is the process which sees the reduction of private farming plots so that arable land can be cultivated on the basis of communal ownership. The use of the term in reference to socialist regimes generally contrasts from the voluntary form of collectivization, such as with the kibbutz in the State of Israel or the French farmers' cooperatives. Collectivization of agriculture, otherwise known as collective farming, was especially apparent in the Soviet Union and Maoist China. Each socialist state instituted programs such as the 5-year plans and Great Leap Forward in order to transform rural structures into more centralized means of production. However, many of these programs were met with hostility from peasants and are accused as having caused widespread famine and death. Here we will be focusing exclusively on the Soviet experience and whether or not collectivization was an appropriate policy for the development of the Soviet Union. This video will also use 1925 as a start date of discussion, as both Soviet output and arable land availability were approaching pre-1914 levels. The finalization of the Russian Civil War ignited a process of forced collectivization in which peasant groups rose up in rebellion known as the Green Armies. The Bolsheviks attempted to quell dissent by establishing committees of poor peasants known as kombeti, however this ultimately failed, which evidently led to the introduction of a mixed economy in the form of the new economic policy. This short-term alleviation of private property rights would quickly subside with the antagonization of the business class known as the Netmen, and with the grain procurement crisis of 1927 to 1928. The grain crisis was sparked by a lack of grain supply to fill the needs of urban population growth. Hence, there were very real appreciatory pressures on grain that rendered the new economic policy as insufficient. With the termination of the mixed economy, collectivization began to take root as early as 1928. However, hostility to private property violations ignited dissent in Abkhazia and the North Caucasus. The deep-rooted tradition of communes due to serfdom also provoked Soviet officials to treat all national minorities like the Russian model. Deer herders and fishermen in the far north were thus treated with the same policies as the nomadic peoples of Central Asia and the mountain peoples of the Caucasus. Such a lack of cultural nuance forced the Soviet government's hand, in which Stalin allowed for the retention of some private property rights and even limited animal husbandry rights. Whilst the West reeled from the after-effects of the Great Depression in late 1929, the Soviet Union had its own challenge to collectivize its entire peasant population, a process loosely termed as dekulakization. The process was shaped by the first 5-year plan of the strictly command economy. However, it was plagued by an overemphasis on industry, and the numbers showed. Whilst industrial targets largely surpassed Stalin's wildest expectations, the consumer economy experienced a degree of stagnation. 20% of arable land was initially targeted for collectivization, yet this figure quickly rose to the majority in the matter of a few years. A genuine war was being waged against the peasantry. And with this came a heavy-handed approach to rural management that was inherited from the NEP, the Sovkhaz. The Sovkhaz were state-run farms that did not rely on subsidies and had state wage dependency, unlike the more autonomous kolkhaz collective farms. Before the first 5-year plan, Sovkhazes produced so little grain, although the collectivization process gifted the state farms massive land seizures. Even with large tracts of land, the Sovkhaz were notoriously inefficient and even had to be retracted in favor of the more successful kolkhaz. However, this too is an overstatement. Kolkhoz farms were still largely kept afloat by personal income of peasant households due to private garden plots. The unrealistic government quotas and grain collections further fueled communal wage compression, which incentivized peasants to pour more labor hours into their private plots. Leases for agricultural equipment also exceeded cost of production, further disrupting village life. A traditional Soviet argument would state that the program was really just focused on destabilizing the bourgeois power of the kulaks, known as affluent farmers. However, this problem is with the vagueness in the term. The excesses of local authorities even warranted criticisms from both party members and, to a small degree, Stalin himself. Stalin predicted that 5% of the peasant population were kulaks, yet a 1927 study shows that the real number would be around 3%. Even more concerning, a large number of non-kulak peasants were included in the 3 rounds of dekulakization, namely from 1930 to 1932. Out of the 15.4 million collectivized peasants, nearly 3.4 million were essentially categorized as kulaks. This represents roughly 22% of the total collectivized peasant population if counting 1933, and was even more skewed in the last round of dekulakization. It goes to show the exaggerated economic weaponization of the kulaks, as a 20% figure on the upper middle class is not even on par with the levels of Scandinavian equality. To the contrary, income inequality ran deep in the Soviet Union up until its collapse, even though Nikita Khrushchev attempted to curb this in the 1950s. Acute problems in collectivization would evidently lead to famine and the deaths of millions of people, especially in the grain-producing region of Ukraine and in Central Asia. Contemporary Ukrainian nationalists would point to a certain intentionality Stalin had for punishing dissidents from the Russian Civil War. However, the evidence is mixed. Roadblocks were set up in order to disrupt the internal trade flows between affected regions, thus limiting grain importation to the affected regions. Anecdotal evidence on distribution preferences is also included, but is hard to confirm. It is, however, without a doubt that Stalin's industry-centric policies partially caused the famines. For example, in 1932 he introduced an internal passport system to limit the impact of rural immigration into the cities, a term coined as odkhod. Thus, cities were largely spared from the famine because grain collections and quotas were still high. Rationing was also denied to absentee workers. However, it should be noted that there is evidence for an absolute grain shortage, thus discrediting some intentionality to the crisis. Centralized machine and tractor stations also required large volumes of produce in order to supplement the lease of equipment, further eroding profit margins. The effects of collectivization were not only felt in Ukraine, but also in Central Asia with the nomadic Kazakh people. A sedentary lifestyle was forced on the Kazakhs who had little experience with agriculture, and as a result 40% of the population died between 1931 and 1933 alone. It should be noted that a typhus epidemic also coincided with this famine. Similar numbers of livestock were also killed throughout the Soviet Union, as they were in Kazakhstan. Two major objections brought up against the blaming of Stalin for collectivization would be grain hoarding and the intentional killing of livestock by peasants. However, these are unwarranted. For the first case, the Soviet Union actually experienced an appreciation of price in industrial equipment as compared to agricultural goods in the late 1920s. Thus, grain hoarding actually helped agricultural price appreciation to sustain wages for peasant farmers. On the second point, when peasants experienced shortage in village grain reserves, they would obviously have to resort to killing off livestock in order to obtain a sufficient daily caloric intake, although intentional killing of livestock was a method of protest as well. To disregard any distortions from the effects of the Second World War, I have excluded economic data from the first half of the 1940s, as it was pretty bleak. However, even with such widespread destruction, it did not seem to be a problem for Stalin, who demanded half the output of the kolkhozes between 1945 and 1948, further compressing local wages and exacerbating widespread migration to cities. The result was a famine in 1946, which claimed the lives of at least 1 million people. Although this was the last major famine in the Soviet Union, the Union did experience future grain shortages that prompted grain imports from abroad. However, this was difficult because of the lack of import capacity that the Union had. An exception to this was the initial success of Nikita Khrushchev's Virgin Lands campaign. After having become the General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1953, he encouraged widespread Russian settlement in Kazakhstan. Having visited the United States, he gained an intense fascination with corn and tried to replicate the US model of large-scale farms. Met with drought and the inefficiencies of larger collective farms, the Virgin Lands campaign would evidently lose favor and become a failure. Even the next General Secretary, Leonid Brezhnev, couldn't cope with the growing grain shortages, even when he poured more national investment into the agricultural industry. The exception to this was the harvest of 1978. However, it got so bad that in 1975, the harvest was merely at the 1963 level. By 1978, such acute shortages to growing demographic demands would incentivize Soviet citizens to create private plots which encompassed 3% of total arable land, yet were responsible for 25% of total agricultural output. Even earlier, in 1974, private agriculture was already consuming a third of all man-hours in agriculture and encompassed a tenth of the entire economy. Using 1950 figures, we can see just how disproportionate agricultural production levels were between the United States and the Soviet Union. Although possessing less arable land as a percent of overall land area, the Soviet Union actually had a roughly comparable population to the US. Thus, the Soviet Union had more arable land per capita than the United States, and this was not even a small number. Let's say 1 acre would be equal to a football field. In 1950, each Soviet citizen had roughly 0.44 more acres than their American counterparts. Mind you that this is an approximation. However, this is nearly half of a football field in extra cultivating space for Soviet citizens. It goes to show the degree of inefficiencies that were plagued by collectivization in the Soviet Union. Roadblocks, internal passports, excessive grain quotas, centralization of collective farms. This all inevitably led to unnecessary policies that brought both misery and death to the Soviet population by and large. Hey everyone, Blitz of the Reich here. Just want to send a quick thanks to all my listeners and subscribers. I was able to pass 500 subscribers earlier last week, so I want to thank you all for all your support. Catch you next time.